In response to reports that police opened fire with rubber bullets on people protesting for their right to safety, sufficient and reliable water in the Eastern Cape last week, Amnesty International South Africa says it is alarmed at reports of the use of excessive force towards people who were protesting for their right to water, which is a fundamental human right. We speak now to Mienke Steytler. She is media officer at Amnesty International South Africa, and she joins me now live via Skype. Good afternoon to you, Mienke. Always good to have you here on the channel.
Thank you. Thank you again for the opportunity.
Now, I think we've had this discussion before, but it certainly looks like nothing has changed since, if we still have people protesting for lack of basic services such as water.
Exactly, and we're over 100 days into lockdown, but as we've discussed before, this isn't an issue that only happened during the pandemic. This is an issue that has been ongoing for years, where people really don't have access to water, and it is a fundamental human right, as you said, and it is probably the most the best defense against the coronavirus. People just need to wash their hands, and yet they don't have the water to do so, or the water that they do have access to is extremely dirty, polluted, and it just is a terrible situation to be in. And then when they stand up to protest this fundamental human right, which the government is obligated by law to provide, they are shot at by the police with rubber bullets.
So, as you say that a number of people infected with coronavirus has actually gone up in the country, and many communities still do not have access to water to wash their hands and protect themselves against the virus. What have you observed? Because we do know that government has on many occasions committed to providing water where needed.
Yes, so we have observed, of course, that government has provided tankers to some communities, but what we're also hearing is that these tankers are not necessarily fit for use. Sometimes the water isn't maintained, the water isn't filled up, the tankers are not placed on the stands that they need to be placed on for use by the communities. And also we've even received reports where tankers are delivered, but communities still have to travel far distances to collect this water. And something we're seeing is that women, and this is something that has trended over the last few days, that women really are bearing the brunt of this, not only with water but with job losses as well. But it is the women that have to walk the long distances. There's safety issues around that, and I mean the situation is just awful. And we did at the start of the pandemic say that of course this was a new situation for everybody, including the government, and we do acknowledge that of course they were putting plans in place, but we feel that it's too slow. We are also we are actually looking at the rate at which they deliver these tanks, where they're delivering them, and we feel that the reporting on it is also too slow. So we continue and reiterate to say that they have to be more transparent, accountable, and progressive in their thinking, because this is really a life and death situation, as we're seeing with a surge in infections in the country, and as we see every day when we wake up, there are more cases of people who are suffering from COVID-19. And therefore, we do need this to be tackled really urgently.
But at the same time, these protests aimed at voicing concerns regarding the lack of services at some communities, they once again bring the issue of police brutality under the spotlight.
Yes, and for us that was alarming. It was alarming that people were protesting for their right to water, but then that added human rights violation of police brutality. Amnesty International doesn't support excessive use of force at all, and we are very worried that this just continues. Again, prior to lockdown, we've seen so many cases of police brutality. We are always talking about it. Police need to be trained, to be sensitized to deal with protesters, to deal with people that are airing their grievances. And now, as we are entering this surge in infections, as we are entering a place where over 3 million people have lost their jobs, as we are entering a weaker economic state than before, it's really worrying to see, because we are worried that people standing up for their rights, and not only water, their right to refuge removal, their right to housing, their right to safety, are they also going to be shot at with rubber bullets? And is this the way that the state is going to deal with people who are literally only demanding their basic human rights?
Now, just in conclusion, talk to us about the 10 on the Tap campaign. What does it entail?
Yes, so in April we launched a campaign. We realized that the right to water is probably one of the top human rights that that is needed to fight this pandemic for South Africa to get through this. And so we are calling on the government to be transparent. What we mean by that is they need to really report and communicate much better on where they are delivering, how they are delivering, who to. Then they also need to be accountable, which links, because they need to report publicly where this is going, how people can keep them accountable, and they need to be progressive. So for us, it's not only about delivering a tanker, so saying that you're going to deliver to 2,000 communities and then dropping it off. It's about, is it going to be maintained? Is the water quality going to be tested? And what are the future plans post-COVID? Is that community going to be given water on a regular basis? And what we mean by that is every day. And is it going to be clean for the future going forward? And people can actually join us in this call to government as well. They can go to our website and all the information is there. It's amnesty.org.za, and they can join their call because we really think change is possible, and we really believe that the right to water is something that needs to happen for all people living in South Africa.
And from where you're sitting, Mienke, do you think that there is light at the end of the tunnel in terms of some communities accessing basic services like your water? Because the reality is the lack of water existed even before this COVID-19 pandemic. So it's a problem that has always been there. It's not anything new.
Exactly, it's not new. And you know what's been interesting is, why did it have to take a pandemic for the government to take action? And yes, we are, of course, receiving reports of communities that now do have water, that now do have sanitation, that do have access to washing their hands, going to the toilet and so forth in a dignified manner. But we feel that there are still too many communities that are struggling, communities in Kwakwa, Makondu, especially in the Eastern Cape. We're also seeing that communities that have really waited for decades, even now, 4 months in, they still don't have water. And that's why we call on the government to be progressive as well, because like you said, this isn't a problem that existed only now. It existed beforehand. And yes, we can look back, and as I said, it is upsetting that it took a pandemic to take action, but let's look forward and let's all engage, and let's really, really solve this once and for all, so that we don't see protests, and that we don't see the police being brutal, and that we see people living dignified lives where they can experience their human rights for real for themselves.
And I suppose this once again raises or highlights the inequalities that still exist amongst people in South Africa.
Yes, totally. So what the pandemic has done is obviously shown that these inequalities, it's really highlighted these inequalities. And again, of course, there are historical issues around this. It's very complicated, but this pandemic has really, really shone a light on this. And I saw an article yesterday that said that, the bottom has fallen out of South Africa, that we're seeing job losses. We're really seeing inequality even skyrocket. We're going to see poverty. We're seeing extremely hungry people, and most worryingly children that are so hungry. And really, if there isn't a wake-up call, we've always talked about wake-up calls, we've been calling on the government for decades, but if this isn't a wake-up call, I don't know what is a wake-up call. And it's really important that resources are put behind this. But also, as I've said, it has to be transparent and accountable. We have to make sure that there is zero tolerance to corruption if we're really going to tackle these inequalities, and if we're really, really going to make South Africa a fair and equal place for every single person who lives here.
All right, Mienke, that's where we leave it for today. Thank you so much for coming through. That's Mienke Steytler. She is a media officer at Amnesty International South Africa, talking to us about their response to reports of police brutality at some community members who had been protesting for the lack of water in their area.